Black smoke choked the wooden platform of Bitter Creek. The locomotive ground to a halt, spitting grease and steam into the dry afternoon heat. Along the boarding line stood the town's finest. Bankers in wool suits that trapped the sweat merchants' wives holding lace parasols against the Montana sun. They did not come to board. They came to watch the town joke. Caleb stood 20 paces from the crowd. Mud caked the hem of his canvas trousers. He kept his head leveled, jaw set tight, ignoring the snickers drifting over the hiss of the train. A woman in a velvet hat pointed her fan at him. The man beside her laughed a wet, rattling sound. The train doors opened. A heavy iron step dropped to the dust. Beatrice stepped down. She held a single leather suitcase. The corners were frayed, the brass buckles tarnished green. Her dress was plain wool, stitched for endurance, not parlors. In Boston, her brothers had called her a barren ledger, a useless spinster before locking the manor doors. They wagered she would break within a week on the frontier. The crowd went quiet for a second, taking in the drab cloth and the worn leather. Then the murmurs started, a pitying click of a tongue, a low, mocking whistle from the livery boy. Beatrice did not look at her boots. She did not shrink into her collar. She turned her neck slow and deliberate. Her eyes cold and sharp as cut glass raked over the platform. She stopped on the woman with the velvet hat. She looked at the banker wiping his neck. She catalogued every sneer, every curled lip, filing the faces away in the cold iron vault of her mind. Then she turned to the giant of a man standing apart from the rest. Caleb didn't move as she approached. Up close he smelled of lye soap, horse sweat, and crushed rock. His hands hung at his sides, thick scarred knuckles split and healed over a dozen times. The town expected her to weep. They waited for the mail-order bride to collapse at the sight of her ruin. Beatrice reached out. She didn't offer her hand delicately. She gripped his heavy, calloused palm. The skin was rough as tree bark. She looked up into his shadowed face. "You look strong enough," she said. Her voice carried no tremor. It cut through the dry air, clear and steady. "We have an empire to build." Caleb looked down at the woman holding his hand. He nodded once. He picked up her battered suitcase and cleared a path through the jeering onlookers. They walked into the dust toward a stretch of barren land that the entire town had already condemned to death. Morning broke over the farm like a cracked yoke, spilling harsh heat over baked dirt and dead sagebrush. The sound of hooves came before the sun fully cleared the ridge. Horace Vance rode a heavy roan gelding. A silver watch chain glinted against his dark wool vest. Beside him rode Sheriff Miller, a shotgun resting casual and heavy across his saddle pommel. Caleb stood by the dry water trough. He didn't speak. He just watched the horses kick up dust in his yard. Vance didn't dismount. He looked at the peeling wood of the cabin, then looked down his nose at Caleb. The banker pulled a folded sheet of heavy parchment from his coat and dropped it. It fluttered down, landing in the dirt at Caleb's boots. "Your old man left a mess," Vance said. His voice was smooth, slick with false pity. $10,000. Principal and interest. You have 30 days to pack up whatever garbage you have left and get off my land. 10,000. A man could break his back for 3 lifetimes in this dust and not pull half that from the ground. Caleb's jaw locked. A thick muscle ticked below his ear. His breathing stopped. He stared at the paper, then at Vance's polished riding boots. Caleb's right hand twitched. His fingers curled inward, hovering inches from the worn leather of his holster. His weight shifted to his back foot. One shot to drop the banker. He didn't care what the sheriff's scattergun did to him after. Dying in the dirt was better than being stripped of his name in it. His fingertips brushed the cold iron of his revolver. A hand clamped over his wrist. It was small, but the grip dug in like a steel clamp. Beatrice stepped in front of him. The morning wind tugged at the fraying collar of her wool dress. She didn't look at Caleb. She kept her eyes locked on Vance as she bent down and retrieved the parchment from the mud. She snapped the paper once, knocking the dirt loose. The sheriff tightened his grip on the shotgun. Vance let out a short, wet laugh. "Can you even read the ink, girl? It says you and this dumb brute are trespassing." Beatrice did not blink. Her eyes tracked across the dense black lines of legal text. She read the stipulations, the boundary markers, the federal land codes printed near the seal. Her index finger stopped on a single buried clause. A slow, chilling smile broke across her face. It carried no warmth, only the sharp edge of a drawn blade. She folded the paper in half, then in quarters, and slipped it into her pocket. 30 days, Beatrice said. Her voice didn't shake. It cut through the dry morning air like a whip. Vance frowned. The smirk slid off his face. 30 days, Beatrice repeated. She stepped closer to the horse, forcing the massive animal to nervously toss its head and step back. "Come back in exactly 30 days, at noon." She tilted her head, memorizing the banker's face the same way she had memorized the crowd at the station. "And bring the sheriff. Bring the mayor. Bring every single person who stood on that train platform yesterday and laughed." She patted the pocket, holding the debt notice. "You're going to want an audience." The town council's blockade was silent but suffocating. No grain arrived from the mercantile. No tools. Even the town blacksmith refused to strike iron for Caleb, claiming his forge was cold for the foreseeable future. Then came the rot. One evening, Caleb pulled the bucket from the well. The water didn't shimmer with its usual clarity. It smelled of sulfur and stagnant sludge. A dead coyote lay sprawled near the stone lip, its throat slit, dropped into the source to taint the earth. Caleb stood in the gathering dark, his face a mask of jagged, frozen rage. He stared at the poisoned hole. He had nothing left but the dirt under his fingernails and the woman standing on the porch. Beatrice did not run for town officials. She did not scream. She pulled a lantern to the kitchen table, cleared away a stack of rusted invoices, and laid out heavy blank sheets of drafting paper. Her charcoal pencil moved with the precision of a surgeon. She drew lines, calculated grades, and traced the hidden topography of the land Caleb's father had once pointed out, a place where the rock was fractured and deep. The next 28 days became a blurred cycle of agony. Caleb turned into a force of nature. He worked through the blisters, through the raw, bleeding skin of his palms, and through the bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull him into the dirt for good. He swung the sledgehammer until his muscles turned to fire. He hauled tons of shale to build the dam, his breath hitching in his chest, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and the brutal dust storms. Beatrice was always there. She didn't offer pity. She offered water from the cistern they had cleaned, and she marked the ground with chalk, showing him where to strike next. On the 28th night, a storm rolled over the ridge. Thunder cracked the sky open, and the sky wept. Caleb was knee-deep in the mud of the trench, his strength finally deserting him. His legs gave out. He collapsed into the muck, the sledgehammer slipping from his numb, shaking fingers. He stayed there, face pressed into the cold, wet soil, too tired to even gasp for air. Beatrice knelt beside him. She ignored the rain soaking through her dress. She gripped his face, forcing his head out of the mud, her thumbs tracing the grit on his jaw. "Look at me, Caleb," she commanded. He opened his eyes. They were hollow, defeated. "Your blood won't fall in vain," she whispered, her voice fierce against the howling wind. "I promised you. I'll make them pay for every drop of this sweat with their own ruin." She pulled him up, dragging his dead weight toward the cabin. Morning came on the 30th day. The sun rose mocking and bright. Caleb stood by the final wall of rock, the hammer heavy in his hands. He took one last ragged breath, swung, and shattered the last of the barrier. Water, cold, clear, and abundant, began to surge forth, singing against the stone. At the exact same moment, the sound of horses thundered across the valley. Vance, the sheriff, and a pack of men were riding toward the ridge, their ropes ready, their grins wide. Caleb leaned on his shovel, watching the dust cloud approach. It was too late. The land was still legally theirs for another hour, but the debt was unpaid. The dust cloud choked the noon sun. Over 24 riders crested the ridge, followed by 3 lacquered buggies. Bitter Creek had come to watch a hanging, even if the rope was made of paper. Vance rode at the front, his silver watch chain catching the harsh light. Behind him, the sheriff gripped his reins, deputies flanking the carriages, where the velvet-hatted women fanned themselves against the stifling heat. They parked in a wide half-circle around the cabin, trampling the few patches of wild grass into the dry earth. The horses stamped and snorted, smelling the damp mud from the newly broken spring, though the water remained hidden behind the rock wall. Vance swung down from his roan. He didn't bother tying it off. He walked to the edge of the porch, the leather soles of his boots crunching on the gravel. He pulled his pocket watch, checked the hands, and snapped the gold casing shut. The click carried in the dead quiet of the yard. 12 o'clock boy, Vance called out. He pitched his voice loud, making sure the women in the buggies could hear. Time to pay the piper or get off the stage. The heavy oak door of the cabin groaned open. Caleb stepped out. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for the sight of a broken man. But Caleb didn't look broken. He looked like a mountain that had decided to stop moving. He wore no gun belt. His shirt was stained with sweat and clay, his sleeves rolled up to expose forearms thick as fence posts. He walked to the edge of the steps and stopped. He crossed his massive arms over his chest. His eyes were flat-locked on Vance, but his hands stayed open. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, a human wall. Then he shifted his weight, leaving the center of the doorway clear. He was yielding the floor. Vance let out a dry, barking laugh. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He tossed it underhand. It landed with a dull, empty thud in the dirt at the bottom of the wooden steps. $10,000, Caleb Vance said. The smirk on his face was a living thing, ugly and wide. Put the coin in the bag, or put your wife in the wagon and start walking. I hear the mining camps up north are always looking for cheap backs and desperate women. A few men in the posse chuckled. The sheriff spat a stream of black tobacco juice into the dust. The heat pressed down like an iron anvil. The silence stretched, pulling tighter and tighter, until the air felt ready to snap. The town waited for the tears. They waited for the dirt-poor cowboy to fall to his knees, and for the useless Boston spinster to beg for a week's grace. A shadow moved inside the dark cabin. A small leather boot stepped onto the threshold. Beatrice stepped into the brutal sunlight. The wind whipped the frayed hem of her wool dress against her boots. She didn't look at the canvas sack in the dirt. She didn't look at the sheriff's shotgun. She carried a flat leather ledger. Vance leaned over his saddle horn. Did you knit that yourself, sweetheart? Put the money in the bag. Beatrice stopped at the top of the stairs. She unclasped the ledger. The heavy cover fell open. Pinned to the inside was a thick parchment stamped at the bottom with a heavy, unbroken circle of crimson wax. The governor's seal. You assumed my brothers threw me out because I was a useless woman, Beatrice said. Her voice was flat, carrying perfectly across the dead yard. They threw me out because I caught them embezzling from the company trust. I built their shipping empire. I wrote their contracts, and I read yours. Vance's horse stamped its hoof. The banker's smile tightened, turning brittle at the edges. Your contract claims this land. Beatrice continued, her finger tracing the air toward the jagged ridge, but it ignores the subterranean flow. You built the Bitter Creek Reservoir on a federal watershed line. That was your first mistake. She stepped down one stair. The wood groaned under her boot. Your second mistake was cutting our water supply. It forced my husband to dig. She looked briefly at Caleb. His chest heaved slowly, his massive arms still crossed, standing like an iron shield at her flank. He didn't just dig a well, Mr. Vance. He shattered the limestone partition holding back the upper aquifer. The sheriff spat his tobacco, missing the trough. What the hell does that mean? It means, Beatrice said, her eyes snapping back to Vance, piercing him like a rusted nail. By federal land law, the headwaters of Bitter Creek now legally surface on our property. The wind died. The stifling heat pressed down on the crowd. The women in the buggies stopped fanning themselves. The silence was absolute. Vance's face drained of color, leaving his skin the shade of dirty chalk. He looked past the cabin toward the ridge where Caleb had swung the hammer in the mud. He heard it then. A low, rushing sound, cutting through the dead quiet. Water. Spilling over rock, flowing thick and heavy onto the dry earth. Beatrice walked down the final steps. She picked up the empty canvas sack from the dust. She walked right up to the massive roan horse and shoved the dirt-stained cloth against Vance's polished leather saddlebag. I didn't come to pay a debt, she said. Her eyes locked onto his, cold and absolute. I came to inform you that the town's reservoir is drying up as we speak. By tomorrow, every man, woman, and bank in Bitter Creek will buy their water from my husband, or you will all die of thirst. Vance's knuckles turned white on the reins. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling breath came out. 10 years of Montana sun baked the old mud of Dead Man's Ridge into foundation stone. The barren dirt that once choked Caleb's boots now ran thick with green alfalfa fed by a network of iron pipes and turning water wheels. Thousands of cattle grazed across the valley. Bitter Creek still existed, but only because Beatrice allowed it. Down at the town's loading docks, an old man heaved 50-pound sacks of grain onto a freight wagon. His fine wool vest was long gone, replaced by frayed canvas and sweat-stained cotton. Horace Vance wiped his cracked lips with a trembling hand. The silver watch chain he used to flaunt had been pawned a decade ago just to buy a month's ration of Caleb's water. A mile up the ridge, a line of polished buggies baked in the midday heat. The merchants and bankers who had crowded the train station 10 years ago now stood in the dust outside a sprawling, 3-story timber and stone manor. They held their hats in their hands, sweat soaking their collars. They came to ask for debt extensions. They came to beg for better irrigation rates. They waited for hours in the dirt. Above them, on the deep-shaded balcony, Caleb leaned against the heavy oak rail. He wore a clean linen shirt, but his chest was still broad as a barn door, his hands still thick with calluses. The fresh cuts from the sledgehammer had long since turned into silver scars. He breathed in the dry air. He still smelled of horse leather and wind. The heavy glass door opened. Beatrice stepped out from the study. She didn't wear frayed wool anymore. Her dress was dark, heavy silk, cut sharp and severe. She held a gold-nibbed fountain pen, her fingers lightly stained with the black ink that controlled the fate of every business within 50 miles. She walked to the rail and stood beside him. She looked down at the men sweating in the yard. She did not smile. She did not sneer. She catalogued their lowered heads the exact same way she had catalogued their mocking faces at the train station. Caleb shifted his weight. He wrapped a massive arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He looked out at the empire stretching to the horizon. He knew the ledger in her who had built every fence line, every water wheel, every brick in the house they slept in. Beatrice rested her hand over his thick forearm. She felt the heavy bone, the shifting muscle under the sleeve. She knew that without the blood he spilled in the storm 10 years ago, her brilliant mind would have rotted in a pauper's grave. They didn't speak. They didn't need to yell their victory into the wind. The silence echoing across the valley was no longer the silence of the defeated. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a kingdom built by the discarded. They stood in the high air looking down at the world that had tried to bury them, letting their shadow stretch out over the dirt.